You can't have a conversation about the future without talking about blockchain. We're going to talk about blockchain and identity is a huge issue in today's world, as we all know. People are scared of identity theft, even if they will spit into a tube and send Ancestry.com their DNA. And you know, I mean, it's kind of a funny world, right? So you're like worried about identity theft, they could clone you. What are you worried about? LifeLock isn't going to protect you when they frame you for murder. Come on. Thank you for the mid-afternoon laughs. I appreciate that. Yeah. All right. Elizabeth Strickler is a passionate believer in creativity, innovation, and entrepreneurship. She has used her talent to tell immersive stories and build a stronger culture economy. Please welcome, ladies and gentlemen, Elizabeth Strickler.
Hello, everybody. We too are going to talk about data and privacy and the B word, blockchain. So, and I have this lovely cast of characters who are going to introduce themselves when I ask them the first question, so they will slowly reveal the mystery as we go forward in this conversation. So we realized that the topic of today's panel is how will the blockchain protect your data and identity? But it's fairly problematic because first, many people don't really know what blockchain is or really don't understand how it works. It's often called the decentralized ledger technology. It's called the trusted peer-to-peer network. Some people call it cryptocurrency, which it's not, and Zenobia is going to help unravel that mystery. We also realize that a lot of people don't know what data actually is. Are we talking about big data? Are we talking about personal data? Are we talking about how many steps you took today? Are we talking about data lakes? Are we talking about citizens' data? And we're going to tease that out. We also realize that people don't know what identifies them, or what is privacy, or if what is identity and what is privacy, and does privacy even exist anymore? Is privacy dead? And then we also realize that we don't know what yours is, what belongs to you, what is your right, what is your ownership. So we're going to tease that out today as well, and I'm asking a lot of questions because somebody earlier said that artificial intelligence can do a lot of giving answers, but humans can ask the questions, so I'm going to be very human today and ask questions. So my first question is, how will the blockchain assist in the data economy? Zenobia?
All right. Hello, I'm Zenobia Godschalk. I run communications for Hedera Hashgraph, which is a public distributed ledger. So I think we'll unpack that a little bit. Blockchain and distributed ledgers are, in their most basic form, a database, a multi-master database where no single entity controls your data. And so, you know, like Elizabeth said, we want to make sure that this discussion is completely separate from crypto. We're not going to talk about currencies, any of those kinds of things. In the context of identity and data, that is important because instead of a single entity owning your data, like a Facebook or an Equifax that has a single database, that's a single point of failure, or where they can control and monetize your data and sell that to other people, on a distributed ledger, that data is shared across all of the computers that participate in the ledger, and so the individual has control over who gets access to that data. And I think that's important in a lot of different data usage instances. It's important in things like the gig economy. It's important when we think about who we want to give our data to as an employee, as an individual, who we want to give our health records to, who we want to give our financial information to, who we want to transact business with. So if we want to think about What does that next generation of internet look like? It's one where we will have more control of our data and also more responsibility for managing that data.
Thank you, Zenobia. So what data can personally identify us? Marco?
Hi, my name is Marco Piovesan. I'm the CEO of InfoMart right up the road in Marietta. And I've been in the consumer data space for about 25 years, so I'm the old guy on the panel, but I try to stay hip by not wearing socks, so it's good. Anyway, so we categorize data in 4 sort of sections. One is inherited data, what you're born with, your biometrics, your face, your fingerprints, anything you're born with. Second category is what you're assigned. So this is when birth certificates, social security numbers, national IDs, driver license are assigned to you for whatever reason. And it both has opportunity and challenges. The third is behavioral, which I think is of most interest to the audience in the room here. It's what is your behavior? How often do you travel? Where do you travel? What's your credit like? Do you have a tattoo? It's all that kind of behavioral data that really identifies you and establishes your digital identity and footprint. And then the fourth area that we look at is relationships. Who you're hanging with online, what groups you're participating with, are you with LinkedIn, who your LinkedIn connections, your Facebook and so forth. So those are the 4 broad categories that we look at. And if we can get to the right balance of that data, we can establish digital identity and a digital wallet going forward.
Awesome. All right, so Neil, as consumers, how can we protect our data via blockchain?
Well, the short answer is you can't right now. I think when we talk about data, the room is full of a lot of people from the MarTech or advertising space. We're all using data inevitably because we believe that there's value in the data. To me, the one thing I've always said is that data is a manifestation of identity for a lot of the reasons that Marco just pointed out. And so that data is increasing in value. As a result, it's getting increasingly more private. Part of the challenge I think that's happening in the space today is that I think the previous speaker was talking a lot about data hacks, et cetera. There's a reason that's happening is because the way in which we're actually storing data, similar to the single database, is flawed. So the blockchain solves that, potentially. We believe that rather than having a macro data management platform like an Oracle or a Salesforce managing all of this data, that it actually needs to become more of a micro DMP controlled by the consumer and protected by the blockchain. That sounds like a lot of buzzwords, but in short, like what it means is that if you take half of the US population and put them into a single database, just like Equifax did, you're basically asking every Russian and Chinese hacker to come and get it, pretty much. So unless you fundamentally change that, you're gonna see it over and over and over again. And so building tools that allow consumers to increasingly take back control of their actual data as a starting place to then use that starting place to either sell data, authenticate, OAuth in using that that initial place. I think that's where the blockchain can potentially come into place.
Okay, well, excellent. So, Emaline, then is property the right paradigm for thinking about data?
Yeah, so typically when we think about how to protect something and how to control it in this lovely capitalist universe of ours, we think about, okay, we should own it as property, right? However, it's actually kind of paradoxical when one thinks about having data as property. And the reason why is because data actually gains in value the more it is available widely to the public. So there's kind of like this crucial rift between our ability to monetize or perhaps be paid for our data as individuals with the fact that data is not a rivalrous good, right, like other commodities. And so actually, when we think about data as individual or personal property, it runs right up against a lot of other uses for data, like public good uses, collective benefit uses. And so we want to be able to sort of balance between thinking about data as something that we can potentially make money from, and data that, when given away, can actually serve its function as a sort of collective tool.
Excellent, thank you. So Marco, how can we tell that data about or from others is real, or if it's fake?
So ideally we want to get to a world of a trusted digital identity using whatever mechanics we can, and ideally, blockchain in this instance. So in today's context, I mean, there's a lot of fake data out there. You see it all. There's a lot of legitimate data out there. Easy tests are, if you get an email from me, is it a legitimate email in terms of a corporate, protocol, etc. If I've got a photograph out there on LinkedIn, does it match the Facebook photograph, etc. So a lot of easy ways to detect what's fake, what's real, or not. But there's also a lot of fake out there that you got no idea about. People creating fake credit identities through the credit bureaus, people creating fake LinkedIn profiles, etc. So you can figure some out, and some they're going to catch you sleeping in terms of digital identity. If we really want to get to this point of permission-based self-sovereign identity through distributed ledgers, etc., that's where we need to head through blockchain, and that should create or help create a lot more digital identity trust out there. But there are two key aspects. The first is the onboarding or the verification of that person, that digital identity. So how are you establishing that trust and that verification? Is it through trust anchors? Is it through issuers, etc.? You really got to look at that aspect. And then the second aspect is obviously the technology, all around, encrypted hashtags and all the technology that my other panelists know way more than I do about the blockchain. But that's kind of, where we're trying to get to in terms of getting away from fake ID to a trusted digital identity.
Okay. We'll get into deep fakes a little bit later. So Zenobia, you, in our earlier conversations, you talked about data personas and dossiers. How are those being created and used?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're seeing them used, criminals are smart, right? And they are running a business just like organizations are running a business. So you have both the challenge of legitimate organizations gathering data from sources that are legitimate, or from us giving them their data. But then you also have criminals, you see hacks that are running the gamut, right? You see sort of your traditional credit card hacks, and credit cards used to be worth a lot of money for each card that was stolen, and now that has kind of shrunk in value as we figured out how to compensate for that. But now you see people stealing things like, frequent flyer miles and the various data that comes with that account. And then you see like the OMB hack. And you put those sets of data together, and those criminals have a very detailed profile on an individual person. And so one of the things that we are seeing is that, they can then go after very specific individuals, right? Very targeted spear phishing that is focused on people who are in positions of power, whether that's in an organization or in a government agency or some other entity. You're also seeing them, be able to do very sophisticated impersonation for things like, filing fraudulent tax returns. So, there's both the data that people are getting legitimately, and then there's also, think about every time you see a hack, what other piece of data are they putting in that puzzle to create this very full picture of who you are to be able to impersonate that.
Interesting. So, Neil, with all of that, the data hacks and data proliferation, what regulations are on the horizon, and what implications do they have on?
There's lots on this. So, I think just kind of picking up on what Zenobia was saying, there's a reason those hacks are taking place is because the data is incredibly valuable, right? So how valuable? I don't think, does the audience have any visibility as to what the overall value of their data is on a per month basis? Most people don't, but let's back into a few quick numbers, right? So if you just use Facebook, it's easy to pick on them. They have 2.2 billion users. They're doing 100 billion in top line, $40 billion in EBITDA. You as a consumer are worth about $25 a month, growing 35% a year, and it has been going on like that for the last 10 years. When you multiply that out by the 1,000+ firms that are using your data, it's not easy. It's pretty easy to get to a calculation that you're worth about $400 to $500 a month. So, I mean, that's only going to go up. So I think what's happening is this is drawn in all the various different regulators. The regulators are pissed off because big technology has basically been kind of pushing them off. The most obvious example is WhatsApp and Facebook. The EU basically said, we'll let this go forward as long as you don't combine the data sources. Everybody says, yep, no chance, we're going to combine the data sources. They get approved 6 months later, they combine the data sources. Why? Because the value of data is really valuable. So the regulation that is coming in is basically to force technology and really every company in the world to start to expose how they're using data and what the value of the data is. They're doing that because they know from a general consumer point of view that by doing that, when the average consumer gets wind of kind of how their data is being used and the overall value of it, they're not going to like it. And you can just point to Cambridge Analytica as a very small example of what's going to happen. So here in the US, you have regulation coming into this market. Most people have no comprehension of what's about to happen. This is literally a live hand grenade that is in the middle of this room right now that no one's paying attention to. Like, we all talk about GDPR, which is the General Data Rights Act in the EU. That comes to the US in the form of the California Consumer Privacy Act, January 1st, 2020, which will make every single person require consent. 20% of US states have similar privacy legislation on the table, including Washington, which is an exact carbon copy of GDPR. So regulation is coming. There's no ifs, ands about it. Like, you have to get consent. The blockchain is that technology, or is potentially that technology that can actually create consent for you to allow you to actually use data in a compliant way. If you don't use data in a compliant way, be prepared to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal, selling tied to people with non-compliant data. That's the backlash that you're faced with, and that's what every brand, every agency, every platform needs to get their head wrapped around.
Thank you. Emaline, how can we empower people through data access and permission, the consumer? Because I think what Neil's talking about is sort of what the responsibility of the business is, but you're speaking more about maybe government or personal responsibility.
Yeah, so in terms of how we can empower people with data, I really want us to think about our role as people, right? Not just sort of these bodies that are emitting data, maybe potentially to own it or to wonder if it's sold or not being sold, but in terms of our role as human beings on this planet, right? Because really that's the subject of data. So where empowerment is concerned, we need to be thinking primarily about about control and about permission. And when I say control, I'm not trying to limit the discussion to the extent to which, I'm aware that my data is being sold when that value could fall into my pocket rather than the, centralized company that's collecting it. But instead to think about control more in terms of, for instance, voting with data. And when I say voting with data, I don't necessarily mean, being able to submit your personal information to go and participate in a national election. I mean, what deep purpose is your data serving, right? Because, for example, when Amazon collects data on us, that data is going primarily into its own research and development to then create all sorts of forms of social engineering and smart cities and things that as citizens and as human beings, we may not necessarily consent to. So my vision for the future of data that actually empowers human beings would be the possibility that from the consumer side or the user side, we get to join platforms as sort of value collectives, right? So we would want to select a platform not necessarily on the basis of whether or not it's free, but on the basis of whether or not the data, the sensitive data, perhaps it's health data, that we give to that platform is being sold to pharmaceutical companies, for example, or is it being used in university research, right, to solve some of our largest problems in health, right? So really important to think about data in terms of contributing as speaking beings to different modes of production in society or different domains of production.
I think on that, like, the best brands in the world are leading with privacy. Like, that's it. Like, so, I mean, we see all kinds of sort of social causes where we remove plastic straws for paper straws. I mean, the biggest brand in the world is Apple. Like, they are absolutely leaning into privacy. I mean, they know that that's the future. They know that that's the direction. I think that as we look kind of forward, it's going to become table stakes. If you're Procter & Gamble, Unilever, Exxon, any of these companies, like, if you're relying on data from which to decision, which we all do, you absolutely need to be including the consumer in that. The challenge is like, how do you actually make that data compliant with all that regulation? And I think to kind of bring it back to the conversation here around the blockchain, the potential of the blockchain is not necessarily specifically in kind of in the tokens or the crypto that people typically tend to focus on. It is in that underlying protocol that a lot of the speakers up here are actually working on, which is, if you can get consumers to take back control of their data, to have that inherent consent layer built in, that will actually solve the biggest gap for pretty much every industry that's using data. And then if those individual platforms then are leading into actually including the consumer in that, that's a pretty progressive way of looking at data and privacy moving forward, and it all can be generated from the blockchain.
Right, it's true, you don't necessarily have to think about what the consumer wants, right? That ostensibly the purpose of data collection, if people actually have the freedom to sort of contribute their data to various social purposes that these companies are representing.
So to your point, Neil, what do you think? We're not going to have time to answer it, but I'm just going to pose it. Today, Facebook announced that the future is private. So they already fixed the problem.
Break at those guys. Like, look, Facebook's on roller skates and they're pouring gasoline on themselves every 4 days. Like, they don't know what the hell they're doing. Like, they're like, today we're into privacy. Like, look, Facebook's strategy is to basically lean into being regulated as a company. Because the reality is that when you move forward in the next 12 months, Facebook is going to get sued by every country that their actual service is available in, for sure. The reason is because there's a lot of individual consumers that are obviously inside of that platform. So Facebook is worried about getting sued by every company, every country around the world. How do you resolve that? Regulate us. It's not our fault anymore. It's the government's problem. So, like, look, the one thing about Facebook and all the platforms that everybody here obviously understands is that one of the requirements is that your data has to be portable. So Facebook has all those 2.2 billion users, Amazon has all those users, Google has all those users. That data has historically been landlocked, right? It's been locked in those platforms. The new world is that that data can float around, right? So you can actually go into Facebook today and pull your actual profile out from 2007 till today, and you can move it around. Now, where can you put it? That's the gap. And I think that's where sort of the most innovation is going to happen, specifically around data protection. I think blockchain has the potential to basically be that protocol to do that. But I think the fact that there's regulation, portability, and the platforms that have harvested and collected all this data, you can literally go and get it and innovate with that. I think that's awesome.
Excellent. Well, thank you, lovely cast of characters. And they're all available to talk to tonight or this afternoon. And because hopefully we just sort of piqued your interest with lots of more questions. And thanks.
Good.
Cool.
Good.
Yeah, that's good.